take a look at what's in the air we breathe. What is the most prominent of all the gases in the air that we breathe? Nitrogen. Nitrogen gas, or N2, with its triple covalent bond, makes up 78.09% of the air we breathe. It doesn't really hurt us. There's an equal portion that's in our bloodstream that's comparable to what's in the atmosphere, but it's not really, doesn't really have that much of an effect. Unless you go diving. If you go diving and try to come up too fast, much of the gas that's dissolved will turn into bubbles instantly, and that can give you an issue. But, you know, come up slowly, and everything will be fine. Nitrogen really won't have much of an effect on you. Beyond that's the one we really do need, which is what? Oxygen. Oxygen gas makes up, or O2, makes up 20.95% of the atmosphere. Now, there may be slight variations here and there. This is an average all over the Earth. Regardless of whether or not you're on top of Mount Everest or swimming in the Dead Sea, highest and lowest elevation points, you know, it doesn't matter. These percentages are going to be about the same. There's something else that changes that we'll talk about here in a second. Now you can already tell we've accounted for, wow, a good portion of it. Breaking out the pink calculator here for this one. All right, so 78.09 plus 20.95. We are now at 99.4% of the atmosphere. Just those two make up most of it. But we can't leave this guy out. Argon. Good news about argon, it's just argon. It's inert. It doesn't need to form any bonds with anything because it's got a full valence. It's happy. So it makes up 0.93% of the atmosphere. Add that up, plus 0.93. Then we come to 99.97. Now, there's another one that can fluctuate and constantly be changing. It has a lot to do with whether or not it rains, and that's how much water, cloud droplets, water vapor, humidity is in the air. I'm not taking that into account. We're assuming dry air here. What's left? Give you a hint. There we go. Carbon dioxide. CO2. This guy makes up a whopping 0.03% of our atmosphere. 0.03%. Not a tremendous quantity, which is good news for us because it's greenhouse gas and because we're trying to get rid of it. Plants like it a lot, and if they didn't have it, we'd be really suffering. Now, I want to kind of illustrate how this works as far as how much of it is actually in the air. Well, how much of it is in the air is a direct correlation to how much pressure, okay, there is in the atmosphere. For our purposes, I'm going to write down this statement, which is going to sound so simple, but it's true. Okay? The higher we go above sea level, column of air above our heads gets shorter. Pressure decreases. Is it really that simple? Yes, it's really exactly that simple. The pressure that's upon us is equal to the column of air that is stacked upon our body from the top of our heads or whatever is on top all the way to the top of the atmosphere. The shorter we make that column, the less pressure is on us. Okay? So here I'm going to draw, here's a mountain. Okay? And here's this sea level. Here's the ocean crashing in down there at the bottom. Yay. That's sea level. Okay. So if I'm standing down here at sea level, not to scale, the column of air on my head, on top of me, is this tall, to the very end of the atmosphere. You're like, that can't be that simple. Well, the pressure that's on you underwater is equal to the column of water that's on top of your head. The further you go down in the water, or on top of your body, the further you go down in the water, the greater that column is, the greater the pressure is. Which is why benthic organisms at the bottom of the ocean have tremendous pressures on their body. We are also benthic organisms. We live at the bottom of a sea of air. Now, the higher up we go, that column gets substantially less, and evidently our body is too. This column is shorter. At sea level, we're going to use, for our purposes, atmospheres would be nice and easy because atmospheric pressure at sea level is 1 atmosphere. But for our purposes, so we can see these changes, is 760 millimeters of mercury. That's a unit of pressure that we really like in human anatomy. It's the same thing we use for blood pressure and so on and so forth. Now, if you're standing on top of Mount Everest, you shouldn't do it for very long, okay? Because the atmospheric pressure on top of Mount Everest is only 228 millimeters of mercury. In fact, you couldn't do it for very long. The pressure in your blood vessels will push fluid out of your capillaries into your lungs and cause pulmonary edema, where you drown in your own fluids if you're up there for very long. So it's not a good idea. All right, so there's this dude named Dalton. Dalton came up with this thing called Dalton's law of partial pressures, which basically says that of this, since there's 760 millimeters of mercury of gas in the atmosphere, that total pressure is equal to the sums of the pressure that each part contributes. For example, nitrogen would contribute to about 78% of that, and oxygen would contribute 20.9% of that, and so on and so forth. Each of them, because if we know the total pressure in the system, if we multiply by each one of these percentages, we'll know what pressure each one would contribute. So let's write this down. We're going to do partial pressures. Okay? If there's 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level, partial pressures are easy to calculate. All we need to do is we got to multiply by the decimal here. So 760 times what? 0.7809. And then we find out that there is 593 what? Millimeters of mercury, because we just simply multiplied by a percentage. We don't have to change the units. Okay? 760, and we multiply that by 0.2095, and we end up with about 159 millimeters of mercury of oxygen that we're breathing. All right, let me do the next one for argon. 0.0093 times 760. We end up with about 7 millimeters of mercury of argon. And carbon dioxide, 0.0003 times 760. We end up with about 0.2 millimeters of mercury. Okay. So let's follow that same thing on top of Mount Everest. And this is at sea level. Can atmospheric pressure be more than 760?
Yeah.
Yes. There are places on Earth that are below sea level. In fact, the Dead Sea is below sea level. Let me find out what its elevation is. The Googles, man. Oh, wow. Nah, that can't be right. Yep. It's right. It's about 1,400 feet below sea level. So it's pretty far down there. So it's going to have pressure that's higher. Also, something to consider is that this pressure changes based on movement of air and cooling and warming of air, and is also influenced by weather patterns. In fact, that's why weather occurs, is because we have a difference of pressure in one place from another, and as a result, air moves to try to regulate that. Okay, so on Everest, at 228 millimeters of mercury, partial pressure so again, just follow through. 0.7809 times 228, and you end up with, you went from 593 to 178 millimeters of mercury. Okay, 0.2095 times 228. We drop this down to about 48 millimeters of mercury. That's why we cannot live in a place like Everest. Most things can't. If you see places, a mountaintop that's high enough, or if the temperatures are warm enough to where you can see trees and plant life and things like that on the mountain, there's something called a tree line. Above that tree line, it's just rocks. Okay? The reason it's just rocks is because above the tree line, plants can't live because there's not enough carbon dioxide, there's not enough gas in the atmosphere for them to be able to live at that point. Okay, so we continue this line here, so 0.0093, and multiply that by 228, and we end up with 2 millimeters of mercury of argon. Again, not super important. But 0.0003 times 228, and we end up with 0.07 millimeters of mercury of CO2. So you can see it has a profound effect the higher up we are. Also, the further up you go, the further apart those molecules are. Down here at sea level, there's a lot more gas molecules closer together, but the higher up we get, the more spread out those gas molecules are. And so it's not just a factor of the column being consistent all the way up and down. The further up in the column you go, the further apart the gas molecules actually are. Which is why if you've ever been in a plane, sometimes they'll have like the outside of the plane temperature reading. It's usually minus 50 or minus 60 degrees Celsius outside of the plane, because the particles of air are so far apart that it doesn't create as much temperature. Okay, now here's a question that you probably are asking or should be asking. Why do partial pressures matter in respiration? Why did I spend so much time talking about partial pressures? What's the deal with that? Answer. Partial pressures determine the direction of diffusion. Diffusion particles move from areas of blank to blank. What's the blanks? Diffusion. For what? High to low concentration. Moving from areas of high concentration to low concentration. Okay. So draw this with me. Here's this little air sac. This is microscopic. There's a tiny little tube that leads into it. What was the little air sac called? Inside of our lungs, we have millions of them.
Alveolar?
Yes. This is a singular. This is alveolus. Why this matters, I'm going to show you. This is where gas exchange actually occurs. Surrounding each alveolus are beds of capillaries. Blood is flowing around here, and it's trying to pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide. It's blood is flowing around the alveolus. Good news is the alveolus is lined with those really, really thin epithelial cells. Do you remember what those were called? Simple. That's right, simple squamous. Sorry. Simple squamous. And again, this one you know, form follows what? Function. These really thin epithelial cells means that oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse straight through them without any trouble. Okay, so inside the alveolus is a PO2, which stands for partial pressure of oxygen. PO2, and if we're at sea level, the outside PO2 was 159 millimeters of mercury. Now here in the alveolus, we're at about a hundo. Well, wait, why? That's not even close. There's a lot of reasons why. One is that oxygen is constantly diffusing from the alveolus into the capillary. I probably should label this. This is the capillaries. Okay. Another reason is because there's a constant mixing of old and new air. You breathe out as much as you can. You do not clear out the lungs entirely. It's physically impossible. There's a residual volume of air that you cannot get rid of in the lungs, no matter how hard you exhale. So there's always a mixing of old air and new air. New air. So the PO2 inside of here is 100 millimeters of mercury. What do you think that the PO2 in the capillary is? More or less? Less, substantially less. PO2 in the capillary is only about 40 millimeters of mercury. Okay? So oxygen has no trouble diffusing from high to low concentration. It's diffusing directly through. What's cool about oxygen too is that it doesn't need to go through like membrane proteins or anything like that. It can diffuse because it's nonpolar. It diffuses directly through the phospholipids of these cells, so it doesn't need to go through any channels or anything. Pretty much it permeates right through to where it needs to go, gets in here. And by the time the blood is gone through here, the PO2 here, after blood has passed through, is going to be what? That's a good guess. Keep going.
140.
Can't be. Why? It can't be 140. Why? I'll tell you the number and then you tell me why. Yes. Say that again. Because of equilibrium. It can't have more oxygen in it than the alveolus does. Okay? Once it's saturated, okay, it'll be once it's gone through, it'll pick up oxygen and be at a PO2 of 100. Okay. Now let's talk about the PCO2. PCO2 of the capillary is 45 millimeters of mercury. That is way higher than the atmosphere as it passes through. Now, in here, in the alveolus, is it going to be more or less than 40? More would be bad.
Less.
Yes, it's less. Why would more be bad?
It would diffuse out of time.
Yeah, it would diffuse back into the bloodstream. Remember, we're moving from high to low. And as long as it's lower in the alveolus than it is in the bloodstream, that means carbon dioxide can diffuse out of the bloodstream until by the time it goes through here, it's to what? It started at 45. 40. Like, well, it doesn't get rid of all the carbon dioxide? No, it doesn't. But it constantly offloads the carbon dioxide. Okay. So let's write this statement and then we'll call it a day today. The direction of gas flow between the alveolus and capillary is determined by the partial pressures of O2 and CO2. Gases will diffuse from blank to blank. One more time. High to low concentration. In this case, pressure.